Right, before we discuss what's happening here on our own shores, let's start by taking a quick look at the elections across the Channel. Quite extraordinary results in from yesterday's parliamentary elections in France. Freddie, you've written about this, but Macron's bluff has been well and truly called, hasn't it?
Yes, we've got Marine Le Pen's National Rally winning on around 33%. We've got to remember this is the first round, so we're going to have the second round next Sunday. That's when we'll fully know the results. But it seems that his bluff has completely failed. The left-wing coalition has come in second, and then Macron's party has come in third. So the big question here is, are we finally going to get the hard right in France, in the government, for the first time since the Second World War? I've written this morning about how Labour are going to see this, because if Keir Starmer does win on Thursday, he's going to be facing a Trumpian government in the US from November potentially, and also this rise to the nationalists in Europe. He'll be this centre-left redoubt, and how is he going to handle it? He's going to be quite isolated and lonely, but I think actually, if you look at what he and David Lammy have been saying in the past few months, it's quite clear that they're happy to engage with Republicans, both MAGA Republicans and more conservative Republicans, and I think the same will apply with Europe. I think it's interesting that Marine Le Pen has said that she supports the Lancaster House Agreement, which is this 2010 agreement that governs the UK-French defence cooperation. We know that the security is going to be absolutely central to how Starmer sees Europe, and I think they feel quite confident that they'll be able to cooperate with Marine Le Pen, and they definitely won't look at her as someone that's too unpalatable to deal with. So that'll be an interesting relationship they'll have to build.
Andrew was listening to the radio this morning, the Today programme, and there was a father, a French immigrant who lived in the country for years. His children were born there, and he was crying on air at this result, saying, I don't have a home here anymore. I mean, is the centre dead?
As Freddie was alluding to, this has not happened since Vichy France, 1944, that a party like this has been anywhere near power. I mean, we have to say that the second round, we don't yet know whether Bardella and the National Front, the National Rally, will actually have a majority in the French Parliament. It looks rather unlikely. So the bigger problem is probably sort of some kind of political paralysis in France, with a National Assembly split three ways, nobody able to agree, and then a very unpopular president sort of sitting awkwardly on top of it. And that will be very difficult for everybody, including us. Some
talk around already today of calling for basically, the left and Macron's more centrist party to come together to push out the National Rally. I mean, is that going to be a problem, though, for democracy if the largest party is effectively pushed out of power?
It is. I think a theme today might well be vanity versus national interest, because is Macron prepared to stand down candidates against leftists to keep out the right? We don't know. That's not his record, putting it gently. And similarly, we must obviously talk about what's going on in the States, where Biden, silly old fool, should really be out by now, but won't.
Well, as you brought it up, let's cross from the Channel to across the pond and that presidential debate from Thursday evening. On a human level, it was just really sad to see the demise of a great public servant, but
it was watched through your fingers, wasn't it?
It was like CCTV from an old people's home. I think what it makes you realise or welcome is Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. We've been talking for 6 weeks about how bad they are and how lots of people are quite apathetic in this country. Right, Then you look across the pond and you go, oh my word, these two are, they can actually speak. They're quite diligent. They work hard. They're not over retirement age. Like, thank God we have them. That was my reaction.
The grass is greener.
Yeah, it was. It was the first time ever.
I think that's absolutely right. For once, we appear to be the sensible country. Yeah. And you look at, we're both the sort of centre-left outliers, but also the sensibilist outliers as well.
But it's interesting in America right now. You've got this debate within the Democratic Party about whether they're going to get rid of Biden. Biden came out the day after that debate. He did this speech where he was very defiant with Jill, his wife, who's a key supporter of his, and it seems as if there's a consensus now that they're going to keep going. I mean, Andrew, you've written in your column this week about the vanity, as you said earlier, of that position, because there is a question about whether he's going to sacrifice the country to Donald Trump to maintain his own pride in this campaign.
Why would he do that? Because surely the better narrative, the epitaph, if you like, is man who served his country for decades, beat Trump, got the economy moving again, and stood aside for the best result for the country, rather than man, maybe he doesn't, presuming he may be able to win, but then he deteriorates in public office.
I couldn't agree more. An act of, as it were, self-abnegatory patriotism at the end of his life. What better final act could you have than that? And the alternative is watching this man, who really can't do it now, fail to do it over the next 4 years. It is hideous, not just for America, but for the entire non-authoritarian world in a very, very dangerous time. You know, you look at the choice the Americans have got, and it is completely unacceptable and frankly terrifying. What clearly needs to happen is there needs to be a Biden family meeting. He needs to stand down, and the Democrats need to find a younger, fresher face, somebody like Newsom or whoever it might be. And that person would absolutely hammer Trump, I think.
What do you make of this odd narrative that I've seen on social media over the weekend? I mean, maybe it's very niche, but I've seen it quite a bit, that those talking about Joe Biden's obvious fragility are somehow fearful of Kamala Harris coming in, and there's a racial element. I mean, I don't see that at all.
Absolutely not. I think we can also all look at the polls and see that Kamala Harris is not the right person to take on Donald Trump, far from it. So they do need to find somebody else. There needs to be brutality and speed at the heart of the Democratic organization. The problem we have, of course, is the Democrats are not known for either of those things.
It was interesting, the Telegraph reported over the weekend that senior Tory cabinet ministers are extremely concerned, and they also want Biden to step aside. I think there is general concern about what's going on, and there'll be pressure for them to change. But again, it doesn't seem like we're going to go in that direction yet.
Reports this morning, actually, that the Biden family are urging him to stay. Do you put much truck in that?
Well, again, we come back to the words like sort of vanity and selfishness and heedlessness. That would be an appalling thing for them to be doing. I can't understand what his wife Jill is doing. I do not understand why she is not saying to him, listen, my dear husband, you've done so well. Yeah. Let's retire. Let's look after the grandchildren. Let's enjoy our last years together in a happy, relatively secure American democracy rather than go through this.
I suppose the argument is that he thinks he can still beat Trump. And we should definitely not write him off, even if he does stay, even if he stumbles through the next two debates and he can't really get out and campaign that much. There's still a chance that he can win. I mean, in the swing states, the polling looks quite equal at the moment.
Yeah, I think we probably should write him off.
I think so too, given Thursday's performance. I mean, we'll turn to the British media in just a moment, but when you've got the New York Times writing editorials saying, time to hand over to someone else, does that cut through?
Just look at the narrative of the past year. It's been quite clear that Joe Biden's senility has been keeping him back from performing in the way that he should. There was a complete omerta in the media about talking about it. As soon as someone did, they would be castigated as undermining the Democratic cause and speculating about his own personal health, and it was seen as completely inappropriate. It seems like that taboo has now been broken, and the day after the debate, you had a New York Times opinion pages full of speculation about whether he should go. So I think the media also has to take some responsibility for the fact that they didn't want to have this conversation 6 months, 9 months ago when it was seen as a Republican Party talking point. That was obviously not true because we could all see it. We could all see what was happening.
The best commentators were early on to this. People like Ezra Klein was saying some way back and was getting, as you said, a lot of grief about it. But now the dam has burst completely. And in terms of rebuilding authority, rebuilding kind of respect from Biden's point of view, it's too late. Once the dam has burst and it's in pieces, it's too late. You can't go back again.
Pretty definitive there. I think we're in agreement. New York Times in the States. Here, the Sunday Times, see what I did there, have come out and backed Labour. Pretty cautious. It was pretty devastating assessment of the Tories as it happens. Very interesting editorial. But how important will that be, or how pleased will the Labour Party be with that endorsement?
They'll be very pleased, and it's very unimportant in my view. I think the age of great newspaper endorsements mattering very much is past, long past actually. It might matter a little bit right on the edges for a few places and a few voters what the Sun does. But even then, I really think this is an election which has moved beyond the traditional printed press.
We've also got to recognise that so much of the press will decide based on the polls rather than their decision impacting the polls. So they're downstream, I think, of politics at the moment.
Well, we still haven't heard from the Sun or the Times, the Daily Times. So you think it doesn't really matter? You think they'll back Labour ultimately?
I think the Times probably won't back Labour. I think they'll go for some kind of slightly neutral, fudged position.
A plague on both your houses.
Rupert Murdoch always wants to be sitting really, really close to power, as close as I'm sitting to Freddie or closer. All the time, that's the editorial principled position, And at the same time, the editor, Tony Gallagher, is no friend of the Labour Party or the left.
And you can see it in their coverage. I mean, the Times have been quite critical of Labour in the past 2 weeks, as you expect to see as you get closer to the election. Newspapers sort of fall into line. And the Sunday Times did this softball interview with Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves on Sunday. So it's quite clear what they're doing. So let's see. I mean, I don't think it matters, but I agree with Andrew.
Have we seen peak reform? It's not been a very good, 10 days really, but it's not been a great weekend. Well, ever since the Channel 4 news footage, which I know there's a big row about, but...
The polling would suggest we have seen the peak. I mean, the polling is quite consistent at the moment that they were bumping right up to sort of 17, 18, and now they're coming back down again. And I think that one MRP poll suggesting they could win 18 MPs is going to look like a big outlier by the end. I think it'll be a handful. Several things are going right for the Conservatives right at the end of the campaign and possibly too late for it to matter. One of them is the air coming out of reform a bit. I'm hearing from lots of people canvassing on the doorstep that the Farage comments on Ukraine are really cutting through, including in the Red Wall. People you wouldn't expect have noticed them, really don't like it. And you've seen Led by Donkeys sort of photobombed Farage rather brilliantly.
With Putin,
with Putin saying how much he loved Nigel. So I think that's happening. And of course, Farage and Reform coming down by just a few points saves a lot of Tory seats. It's really important for them.
Something that Ben's talked about, isn't it? That just a couple of points in the polls is the difference between a bad result and annihilation.
Completely. That's because we've got so many marginal seats, as we've spoken about before. Reform, I don't think have peaked. I think Reform are facing 5 years of acceleration, and we're just at the start of that. It was a huge mistake for Farage to make those Ukraine comments. I was speaking to some Reform insiders last week, and they've accepted that it was a complete faux pas, and he shouldn't have done it, and it was bad national campaigning. You're 5 days out of a campaign. If you want to say something about Ukraine, wait a week and say it on Friday. So I think there's a little bit of inexperience there. The counter to that is Farage is a honest politician. That's how he will portray it. He'll just say what he thinks, and he said that since 2011 in the European Parliament. So in his mind, he's consistent. The other thing, though, I think, is we're seeing Reform takes some votes from Labour. I was speaking to some Labour MPs last week. They say it's coming up on the doorstep. They're extremely concerned about it. And I think if Labour don't do what they're promising to do, both by cutting immigration immediately, quite severely, and by rebuilding the public realm, then you're going to see the radical right do extremely well in the next 5 years. And I think that will be Keir Starmer's fault.
I'm slightly more optimistic than you, Freddie, because I do think that the entire election campaign has showed us that all parties, yes, have had the odd rogue character that's been suspended and things have come up. But when you look at the number of Reform candidates, I mean, it's not just one or two that have slipped through the net, as Nigel Farage has said. And the reason that people had no difficulty believing what Andrew Parker said and his disgraceful, vile, racist comments about the Prime Minister is because we've seen that plenty of other people standing for reform hold similar views and other revolting opinions. So even one of their own candidates now is backing the Conservatives. So I hope you're wrong.
But the key thing for Reform here is to build the party infrastructure that they currently lack. They don't have these party local branches, they don't have councillors, they don't have this base, this bedrock by which they can sort of build and get the candidates that they need, and that could change in the next 5 years.
They're not a party, of course.
Exactly.
They're a private company owned by Nigel Farage. But I mean, to be absolutely clear, it is possible that the Reform move further forward over time, but I think they've peaked in this election campaign for now. I think that is one piece of good news for the Conservatives. Second piece of good news for the Conservatives, again, it's anecdotal, but I'm hearing it a lot on the doorstep, is that the tax attacks are really beginning to cut home. People are starting to raise tax increases with Labour canvassers all around the country. And that might, as it were, I don't think it's enough to turn the election, but it'll stem the losses perhaps. And, there are already indications that in some key areas the Conservatives are doing better on the ground than the polling suggests. So I just think it is now possible, as it didn't seem to be possible a couple of weeks ago, that the Conservatives will come back with enough MPs to get a new leader and to rebuild in a way that fends off reform. And there's a lot of talk about Penny Mordaunt, who I now think will keep her seat and will be, is a plausible new leader. So I think that notion of the Conservative family crumbling completely and vanishing away, which might still happen. I mean, these polls are extraordinary, might happen, but it's looking a little bit less likely this week than it was 2 weeks ago.
I think a key question for reform is how you can get Nigel Farage's Trumpian politics and apply it to the UK, because I think many people in the UK don't like Donald Trump, even if they're sort of reform voting of that demographic. They don't like Trump. It's interesting that I think Farage has come out today or yesterday to sort of condemn Marine Le Pen's victory in France. I think Reform are recognising now that they have to clear up the act as quickly as possible because they're on the national stage, and with success comes scrutiny. That's a story of the past 2 weeks that we've seen. So I do think they will change and they will adapt and they will improve. The question is, can he resist those Trumpian urges that I don't think will do that well in British politics? But as we've spoken about before, Andrew, will the electorate move towards him? Will this sort of conspiratorial online politics infiltrate in the UK? We've got to remember that 25% of people in the UK think the government created the cost of living crisis to keep people in their home. We're not immune as a country from conspiracy theories.
No, you're right.
We are part of exactly the same echo chamber system as the United States has developed. In fact, it is the United States system that basically is zinging and pinging around the UK electorate. But I mean, I think the fundamental question, Freddie said earlier on in our conversation, if Starmer is able to actually make a difference to working people across the country in terms of rebuilding public services, in terms of ensuring that people are paid a little bit better and treated better in the gig economy, and in terms of stopping the extraordinary levels of immigration we've seen over the last few years, then I think none of this really matters. But if he fails, then the consequences of failure now are much worse than they've ever been before.